All right, we are going live. My name is Kevin. I'm joined with Logan, and we are going to cover responsive PX pages in this Tridium talk. Let me keep my focus. All right, so a little housekeeping. Questions should be submitted via the QA tab, which you should find on your screen. We are recording this session, so we will be posting it after we zip it into a file. We'll also share the example station that I'm demoing. So we did that last time. This is the second time we've done this responsive talk. We took a lot of feedback from the Q&A, and I built a couple more examples. So there's actually more content in this one, and usually that's the way it is. As I learn and as I get more questions, we start building out more and more examples. So you can find these at the resources page on Tridium.com. You hit Tridium Talks, it jumps to the bottom of the page, and you just look for the 2019 talks, and you can find these resources, and that's how they displayed them. It was the playback of the recording, the responsive station, and frequently asked questions. So with that, I'm going to kind of go through the basics. This is stuff that in the last time I did the talk, I kind of flew by and wanted to make sure that we're all caught up. I will tell you that this morning I realized that the default font in Niagara is not the best web font, so I Googled the best safe web fonts to find out that Arial. I'll grab that. So I started to use that, but there were a couple comments that, hey, your font's not web-like. So that has been fixed, and I know. So Niagara 4.6, what have we done? So we've added a couple new panes. There's a flow pane and a responsive pane that you need to be aware of. That's the two mechanisms that I will use to create one PX page that will actually work on a mobile phone, a tablet, or a large screen. We also include a couple examples. You'll see the examples folder here. Those will give you the actual content of some of the examples that we'll walk through. The other thing is that there's this, if you do a search for palette, this PX editor, it has a tool called the responsive migration. Logan will actually talk about that, but that's kind of nice tool to have to kind of run through a station that's not responsive and get it semi-responsive, and I'll show you what that means. So technically, when I use those two panes, it looks something like this, right? I have a scroll pane. And by the way, in 4.6, the behaviors now is the scroll pane is the root. There's a reason for that, because if you can do all this responsive and then you don't give a scroll pane, you can actually look at only the top part of that content as it reflows. So you need to have that scroll pane as the root. The flow is the container that all of my little blocks, and you'll see there's a 7-to-7 correspondence with the number of responsive blocks to the blocks that are appearing on the side. So essentially you'll see, I'll kind of walk through my methodology of the block sizes. But each one of those responsive will fill in the appropriate space and repaginate automatically inside that flow pane. So what is a flow pane? It essentially is that container that those responsive panes will flow into. And there are some things that you can set. You can set the default alignment for that pane. You can change the background color. You can create these little gaps, and you'll see that in some of my examples. You can align the rows center. So these are just typical components, and of course you can make that whole pane visible or not visible. When you look at a responsive pane, two things I'll call out is, again, you can force a new row. I use this a lot. This is how you can kind of keep some of your designs organized. So keep that in mind. There's this max width and min width. And this is kind of where you can kind of tell the responsive pane how much padding you want, how many columns to actually show. And I'll demonstrate that. And then I actually use the visible on and off in a couple UI components that I'll share with you and show. Again, there are some examples of each of these components in the examples folder to get you started, or otherwise download this station, and that will kind of jumpstart you as well. So when you look at the max width, there are absolute values, percentages, and preferred. I kind of gravitate towards preferred, and I'll show you. It's just kind of my style with the block. I will show you when when you look at the max width for my blocks, I actually will set that max width as a percentage. If I want 3, I'll use 33%. The min width, I will tell you, that one for the longest time eluded me until I started to work through the responsive examples, and I'll show you where it bit me. But min width, for the way I do things, I need to make sure is preference. So I can actually set up a max width where I can control how many blocks appear in a row. And then for my min width, I usually keep preferred. So I'll just kind of show you that as well. So Canvas pane is actually changed. It's gotten a couple new additions. This is again for the ability that prior to this, you would take a PX page and it would just squish it down to the size of your mobile, right? And you have this little tiny picture and you couldn't do anything with it. So what we've done here is we actually give you a max and a min. And this is pretty cool because you can actually now control how big or how small your main graphic will become. And that's where that migration tool also comes into place. It lets you set those by default. So keep that in mind. You don't have to have everything that I'm demonstrating to make your page responsive. You can kind of take baby steps, and this max and min scale factor is one of those steps that you can take to get it to accommodate. And why that's kind of cool is you can at least tell your graphics, don't go any smaller than this because it's ridiculously too small, and then you have to pinch and zoom on the phone. Here you can say just go down to this certain level and then let the scroll bar appear. And again, keep in mind that there is a scale. The best use for these max and min is to do fit to ratio. So the other component, and again, this is just the basics to kind of cover it before I dig into Workbench here, is that the main UI delivery through our web services is also responsive. So you see that the engineers spent some time making things touch friendly, with sliding back and forth. So this is looking at it on an iPhone 5S. You'll see that the actual views actually are finger friendly, all to accommodate on the multiple devices. And here it is in landscape. So you'll see that it grabs a little more area. You can see the little message here, and we're actually going to build out this example. It's actually being responsive as I click through the different menus as well. Okay, so when you look at the components, right, we have base components within Niagara, like the alarm consoles and things like that. All of those have become responsive, and then we give you 2 new panes to allow you to create your own responsive panes. Okay, so that is the basics. I essentially have to put those on a PowerPoint deck so I don't forget to cover them. So let's kind of dig into how we create a responsive pane. And again, I'm going to kind of review what I showed last time, and then we'll kind of build on it, and I'll kind of show you some of the answers to some of the questions that we got last time. But I'm going to start out, and just like a cooking show on TV, I think I even used that same comparison. I'm going to use these different stages that I have built out. Okay, and so when we look at the widget tree, my base component for this particular PX page that I'm building out is the scroll pane. Again, if you don't use a scroll pane, you'll get into situations where everything will flow for the first half of the display, and then you can't see anything on the bottom because you forgot to include the scroll pane. All right, and I'll show you some tricks that I used that on some of our older panes. And then I added a flow pane. So the flow pane is that container that will now take all my individual blocks and flow them out. Now, in part of the way I'd like to do this, I want to control the layout of my UI. So I'm actually going to create a canvas pane that is inside this responsive pane. And I came to the conclusion of the width of 300 by 100 by just playing, and I'll show you my sample pages where I try to build that out. And that essentially allows me to fit this block on an iPhone 5. I think iPhone 5 or iPhone SE or something like that. And so I kind of went down to what is the smallest display size that I want to kind of target on that, and I build up from there. So these numbers, there's nothing really magical about them other than I tried them out and figured out that they fit in the pixel sizes for those devices. okay? And that is going to become my first Lego block, right? I'm going to create that for my canvas pane. I can do coloring, I can do all those things. In this instance, I'm not going to do any scale, min or max scale for these, because these blocks are going to flow appropriately to the screen size. Okay, so again, the max and min scale factor are usually for a page that you know you can't break down into responsive, and it gives you more control of how that will look on a phone. So with that, usually what I do is once I get my canvas size, if I wanted to create others, right, I just go and I duplicate it, right, and now I've got 2 blocks. And one of the things you'll learn is that I can force a new row. So usually on the first line of things, I'm going to come up and say, hey, force a new row, because I want this one to always appear on row 1. My max width, I came up with the calculation, essentially is taking how many devices you have or how many blocks you want to appear, and then dividing them by the number. So I want 3 blocks, so I'm going to do about 33%. Here's this min width. This always bites me. So I will show you why I need to always remind myself to make that preferred. Because what I want to do is I want to tell essentially the responsive component that in the flow pane, I need this block to only take up about 33%. And the next one will take up another 33%, and then the next one will take another 30%. The minimum, I want to say, when you squish these things down, I don't want them to be any smaller than the physical block that I have aligned, right, for that canvas pane. So that's why I said that to preferred. But in my examples, you'll see that I forget that sometimes. And so the other thing is do this before you duplicate it, and you don't have to set it for each piece of the puzzle. So this one is true for force new row, because that's the first one. This one is false, because I want that to follow the previous one. And then if I wanted to duplicate that again, now I have 3 blocks, right? And in Workbench, I can see how they flow, right? They're looking at that same container. You'll see that they'll have 3 on there. When one falls to the next line, it creates the appropriate padding, right? And so as I scroll this out, right, you'll see the padding gets bigger and bigger in between the blocks. So I'll always try to maximize that layout in the display. Okay. So that's a little bit about how I got to this point. So if I go to stage 1, and I'm not going to save that. Just like the cooking school, I have something already in the oven. So in this pane, I went and designed, you're looking at that one block that I just talked about, 33, and I have my min width set to preference. I've gone ahead and added the information that I wanted to be on this. So I'm starting to count some alarm console components. So I put those on there. Essentially, then I duplicate that like I did the blanks. And that's going to get me to stage 2, which is now I have the 3 panels that I want to be responsive with graphics. And so we're not looking at blocks, spare blocks, right? Or blank blocks. So now my responsive is the 3 components, 33%. So I am only going to have 3 on a row. And then I want them to flow appropriately. Okay. So there's nothing really different about either one of these once I design them, other than I have different content on those blocks, and then those will flow appropriately. Okay. So when we look at stage 3, essentially I have one other scroll pane that I've added, or one other responsive pane that I've added, which is just a block of text. It's a label. And why I do that is it does some kind of interesting things where I can say that I need that title to be the 100% of the screen, right? I need it to, if it's on an iPhone, that black banner will go the whole top of the screen. If it's on an iPad, it will be on the top. If it's on a desktop, it will be on the top. So this is kind of like one of those little tricks that I've found over creating some responsive pages that I kind of like. And so that has its own just content. There is no PX page. That way it can expand the entire length of the display. Okay. So that's the only other addition. And then if we go to stage 4, I'm going to take that, right? And by the way, if I want to move these around, right, the arrows let you sort these things. So I want that on top. This one has a new line. See, force new line. Then my first responsive block has a force new line. And then my last one for the alarm console has a force new line. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the alarm console. So I just drag that widget out so that I now have a responsive page with my 3 blocks. And then you'll notice that if we look at this page, that console is in its own responsive pane. So if I click there, that web widget is that's the only thing there. And then I have a couple footer things that are down here on the bottom that I kind of wanted to center out. So again, our widgets now are responsive. And so what's cool, right, is that my 3 blocks are told to just make sure that you're at least showing each block, but you can put 3 on a line. The alarm console says, hey, take up 100% of your empty row, right? So it's in its own row itself, and it's going to grab the entire size of that window and give me a responsive where as I shrink this down, less and less of the alarm console shows. So it truly becomes responsive. Okay, so that's essentially how I built it. So how do you test this? How do you see what this is going to look like on a mobile device? And so one of the things that you can do is Chrome has a feature, which I'm already in. And how I get there is I go to More Tools and I say Developer Tools. It has a mode where I can actually bring up a responsive design, or I can bring up multiple screen sizes that are out there. Okay, so let's go navigate to my example here, which is up in my playground, and we want to do responsive alarms. So here's the example that we just built out. This is what it looks like on an iPhone SE. So you'll see that my blocks, I could probably have done a couple more pixels, but it's all there. I have that scroll. Remember how we have the root with the scroll? That allows me to see if I can bring this up so we can kind of see both here. All right, bring that back up. So here I have the 3 blocks at the top, 1, 2, 3. Then I have my title, and you can see that these are told to go ahead and bring themselves down. I just did a little different alignment to kind of cascade them. You can see the 3 blocks that I created are formatting to this appropriate page. And then you can see the alarm console said, okay, my screen size is pretty small, so I'm going to squish everything down into relevance. So let's actually look at some content. So I built out this thing that if you click the building, mayhem happens inside. So my building lost power. I have a bunch of critical alarms, and you can see there they all fit on this size screen. If I put the iPhone to landscape, I'll get a little more information, right? So each of my blocks pads appropriately to fit on that new line. And then I can actually see the alarm console display that content all on the phone. So I've designed it so that it can be on an iPhone 5. I can take it to a new 10. So here's what it would look like on an iPhone 10. Now, it seems a little fuzzy. The thing that Chrome does is it actually reduces the browser zoom to make sure that the entire window of the device pops in. And where you'll see that is if I go to an iPad and I'm not in landscape, it looks like it's scaling on me. Well, it is. It's just the browser. It doesn't look that way on an iPad. It just needs to get the entire display inside the browser window. So here's the same console that we just designed on an iPad. So I could get 2x2 with a 1. And you'll see I have all my alarm information, and my footers and headers are all centering around there. Let's look at it in iPad Pro. So get even more density. So on a Pro, I can get 3 across in this format, whether it's landscape or portrait. So truly responsive, looks at the display or the device it's running on, and then repaginates accordingly. So here we'll do an iPhone 6 Plus, a little bigger, see how that looks. Okay. So pretty much 2 panes. It's the flow pane, right? The scroll pane is the root, the flow, and the responsive. how I figured out how these things lay out is I essentially created a bunch of test screens, right? So here we have things going right and left, formatting them in different ways, and I can just see how they repaginate on the screen before I go and pull them up in the browser. I tried left, I tried center fill, right justify, here's a center justify, here's my pane called squish. So you remember that min width where I had 20%? Look how that can kind of mess things up down below on my other blocks. So if I open this up, they grow appropriately, but if I squish them with that minimum, they kind of fold on top of themselves. So that's where I was telling you, if you create a block, you might want to make the minimum width preferred. Okay, so here's another example of a tank, right? So this is, if I go to the actual responsive here and go back to my tank. So you'll see that the tank, if we're looking at an iPhone, we'll go to maybe the iPad Pro and let that out. So here's this tank. I can go ahead and start the tank transfer. It's going to repaginate that depending on what I'm looking at. So if I go to the iPhone X, it's going to shrink it down. So this is that example where I can shrink it all the way down where it's too small, right? Which I'm letting it because I didn't set the maximum in. And so you have to kind of be the judge of how small you want your particular graphics to be. I did do the tank transfer in kind of like a UI non-graphic representation. So if I flip this over here, we can actually get a little better view. So I have a couple indicators, a simulator. I can go ahead and reset the tanks and start the transfer. And then I get a little UI that would run on my phone instead of showing two tanks of the fill level of each. So these are just some of the, you'll see that I kind of gravitate to these little blocks. I can kind of do some pretty cool things with them. For instance, if I go into my analytics, and I think that was in my responsive playground, and I don't think I have it in this station. Oh, no, yep, I don't, because I'm using a space. So let me show them to you here. So here, if I look at my comfort algorithms, right, I can control in responsive how those blocks appear and work, and then how they actually repaginate and flow. So I designed this PX page that can then be universally used on any type of mobile device or any type of screen. So that's a little bit about the basics. I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to let Logan talk through the tool. So the other thing that I did is I tried to look at what a responsive pane would do inside our traditional pane. So here's a split pane. So essentially it just has two elements in that split pane. So essentially what I did is I took the content and made a flow pane and a scroll pane and a responsive pane all the way down, and then I just put the web widget. And then boom, it knew enough from those two elements that it should just take up the right and left pane as much as it can. So as this screen gets bigger, each half will get as big as well. I did that same type of design in our tabbed response. So I just wanted to see how it would act with the responsive. So we have responsive inside the two tabs. And then I really got kind of creative and kind of wild where I was getting a couple questions on how we could do traditional layout responsive. So here I did an edge pane, and then I designed it so that the middle is the responsive piece. And so if I go back to the browser and I pull up that piece in my panes, and we're going to do 5, it will allow me to do some interesting things. I created scroll panes for each of the halves, so that allows me to scroll independently the menu, and then it allows me to scroll independently the middle section as well as the right section. The only thing you have to worry about in your designs is the left and right. They're fixed size by your canvas, right? So I have a small canvas that all of these replicate through, and same size. So these aren't dynamic like these panes are. The only one that's going to be responsive is the center pane, and then the other ones I'm just kind of turning off and on how they should look, right? So on how much more information I can get on there, and then I can hide, bring that back up, and notice that my blocks automatically moved out of the way because that center is the responsive pane. So that's kind of like a tips and tricks on taking some of the older stuff and modernizing it with a responsive pane. So that's a lot of information. This is kind of like asking you to drink from a fire hydrant. So we will, again, post the station that will allow you to take a look at some of my work on how I created the flows and how I tested them and how I came to the conclusion of using the 300 by 100 or what have you for the phone, right? You'll see some examples in here where I have headers that have solid colors and how they all fit the 3 by 2 types of things. You'll see another example for how the alarm schedule is designed to be responsive now and lets you actually do things with your finger on the actual display. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and Logan's going to show you a real quick tool, and we're only going to take another maybe 10 minutes because we're getting close to the half-hour mark, and then we'll open it up for Q&A where we'll take a look what the questions were in the QA thing. So with that, I'm going to say, Logan, take it away to show that cool tool.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Can you see my workbench?
I can.
Okay. So I'm going to talk real quick about specifically about the canvas pane scaling and how this responsive migration tool will allow you to make sort of bulk changes to edit the canvas pane scaling on individual pages. So here's just a real quick example. I have a very large graphic, just one big label, and there, as was the default in AX and previous versions of N4, there is no scaling. So if I shrink down my PX page, then it starts to go over the edge, and I have to start scrolling up and down, left and right, in order to see the whole graphic. And in order to sort of get around this, a canvas pane widget has this option for scaling. This has been around for a while. I can choose to fit ratio, fit width, fit height, just different sorts of types of scaling. Probably the most common scaling that I would use is fit ratio, because fit ratio allows the canvas pane to get bigger or smaller and also maintain the aspect ratio so it doesn't get too wide or too vertically skinny. And as Kevin mentioned, what's new is this max scale factor and the min scale factor, which determine how large or how small. So by setting these, like if I set this to the max scale factor would be 1.25, so I would allow it to get a little bit bigger, and set the min scale factor to maybe, if I set that to 0.25, then that would mean that my canvas pane could scale quite small. And by making these changes, you can see that my canvas pane will now scale down to a certain point, but because I set that minimum scale factor, it won't scale any smaller than that. And same for max, it won't get too much bigger. So by doing this, I have the ability to control how it scales up and down as I show my PX page on different form factors, different phones and tablets and the like. So this sort of scaling is probably going to apply to pre-existing PX pages that had no scaling, but you might want them to scale down or scale up to fit different devices without having to completely retool or relay out your PX pages. So to that end, we've provided this tool that lives in the PX editor palette. And in order to use this, I'm going to drag an instance of it to my program service. And what this will do is, if I go into the program editor here, there will be full documentation explaining what all the options do. I'll just walk through them really quickly. What this will do is it will go through an entire directory full of PX pages and apply that canvas pane scaling to them. So if you have a lot of existing graphics where you don't want to completely relay them out, but just want them to scale up and down, you can apply that to all your graphics at once. So the file path will allow me to point at a particular directory full of PX pages. It's going to default to the PX root, so it's going to look at all your PX graphics by default. I can filter this down to only look at particular PX pages if I like. The couple options that I want to point out are this wrap, root, and scroll pane. The canvas pane scaling will not work correctly if the root of your PX graphic is not a scroll pane. So this will take any PX pages where the canvas pane is directly the root, and it will simply make the root a scroll pane and put the canvas pane into that scroll pane. And here you can set the min scale and the max scale, just like we did manually in the PX page, and which scale mode we want. When I'm ready to run this, there are a couple options. I strongly recommend that the first thing you do is a dry run, and be sure to back up all of your PX pages to a safe place before you do either of these. And what the dry run will do is it will list out exactly what it's going to do. It will tell you which PX pages it's going to edit, what changes it's going to make, so you can see exactly what it's going to do before you actually do it. Dry run will make no actual changes. Execute will perform the changes. So after you run this tool, your pre-existing PX pages should scale up and down nicely to fit different devices. And that's about all I got. So I will hand back to Kevin.
Very good. Thank you. So again, when we first started to do responsive, this migration tool is a wonderful tool because it's kind of like the baby step. It will take an existing station, add in, once you move to 4.6 or higher, it will allow you then to take all of those existing PX pages, run this tool, and not have to worry about going into every single one to set up those basic functionality of how it would scroll and what size it should be on all those different mobile devices. So this is kind of a good way of starting that process, and then you can start to look at how you can create additional new pages with the responsive pane and the flow pane. So pretty good stuff. So with that, we've answered a bunch. I see a whole bunch of new questions that are coming in, so we'll take a live Q&A here. I'm going to share my screen real quick. So Logan, will you stop other screen share? Yes, we're going to do that. I'm going to show, I got a question pertaining to how do you get to see the devices in Chrome? And so I kind of glossed over that. So the problem is it remembers your default. So I have it set up a certain way and it will appear, but how you get there to get this, otherwise when you go to your local host, and I'm just seeing how it's working on this main browser. If you go into the menu at the far right, go down to more tools, then you'll see an option called developer tools. So once you bring up developer tools, I have an undocked version, so it throws up two windows. Normally that is, I think somewhere on here, by default, it says it's docked. I think that's not it, but that's the icon you need to get the thing. So somewhere along the line, I battled this where it would just show up on the side, and somehow I figured out how to undock it. Now I can't remember how to dock it. So that's essentially how you get there, is this little device icon. It says toggle device toolbar in the dev tools, and then that will allow you to get to a responsive and these set sizes that Google ships. Okay. This is actually brand new, this throttling thing, which I think it's starting to look at how different types of devices interoperates. So that's how you get to it. Menu, more tools, dev tools, and then normally this docks inside this window. And oh, here's the dock. So normally it appears like this. There we go. Right, and then I clicked on this icon here to give me the screen sizes. So hopefully that clears it up. That's the default way you get it, and eventually you're going to say, well, that's I don't want to see all this code running on the side. I just want to pull that out, and I was able to get it from its menu and undock it, and then toss it to the side so that's all I have. Good question. There was another question I think that flew by. All of these responsives are available in 4.6 and higher. So all of this carries over to 4.7 as well as 4.8 that we're actually testing now. So somebody was answering my question so on how to undock and dock the term. So there you have it. I stumbled across the answer, but thank you. If I could read and move the mouse at the same time, it probably would have saved me some time. So what does the term responsive relate to? So essentially it's a responsive web is what you'll hear in the industry, and that is the ability to, instead of designing a web page for an iPhone and then turn around and design the exact same web page for a tablet and then turn around and design it for a desktop, responsive technology allows the browser and the elements within that window to repaginate themselves appropriately or scale themselves appropriately to the size of the screen. So that's where you'll hear responsive and how it relates. So we added 2 panes that use that web standard to allow us to have that same behavior within a PX page. And then that essentially is going to cause us to, I like this word, deprecate the mobile PX page, right? We had this before 4.7 or 4.6, right? You had to do the same thing. I had to design a special version for a phone. Here, I just want to design one because I have no idea what screen you're going to watch this on, right? You're going to look it on a phone, a tablet, a display. And in fact, you walk into buildings today and they have a giant dashboard, right, of their energy uses. So I've designed some responsive pages that show on the phone, the tablet, and then it actually works on a wall. So it's pretty cool. All right, so again, we've got a lot of questions that we have answered, so you should be able to see those answers, and if you ask them, see those answers, we will actually summarize all of the questions as well so that you can have a reference to those as well. Okay, does it work in all browsers? That is a great question, and it should. There's always that should, right? The internet uses essentially open standards, so we're following those open standards and using those frameworks. So I haven't in our modern browsers, so that would be Chrome, Firefox, the new Edge product from Microsoft, not IE, because IE is right. That's an older technology. Responsive works spot on. In fact, I think I was reading Edge actually is going to use Chrome in the next version of Windows. So if you use those modern browsers, you're right on target and they will work appropriately. So again, go ahead.
Sorry, Kevin, that's true. I just want to add that we did test this in the latest version of IE, which is IE 11, so it should work there too.
There you go. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, for joining our Tridium Talk today. You'll see that we'll have others that will publish on what those topics are. If you want to leave some comments on what topics you're interested in, please do, because we will look at creating those. Every time that I do a particular topic, I will always build new content and add more content. So again, from the last time you saw this, I added some more features because I can take the feedback that I get from these talks as well as conferences and build that in. So again, thank you for your time. This is pretty cool stuff. I have a lot of fun trying to put together designs, and I hope you do too. So thank you very much.